and some local artists. So stay with us. This last session, I want to introduce BRIANA GREER from, Solid Solutions Geosciences. Solid Solutions Geosciences. My apologies, BRIANA. She's on the steering committee with us. She was incredibly helpful last year. She's been wonderful this year, and we're so happy to have her on our team. So BRIANA will introduce the next speakers.
Thank you, everyone, and let's give Alex a quick hand for being such a great MC. Wrestled the mic away from him. Give him a hand here. Really, it was just a good reason to take off my mask. So my name is BRIANA GREER, and my company is Solid Solution Geosciences. We do a lot of discharge reporting, mine reporting, sampling, operator and responsible charge type activities, as well as baseline characterizations. I've worked in mines all over the world. I've worked on ports and any number of issues that involve metals transport in water. And I was really excited about this uniting of the arts and mining, because, you know, it's been said that mining is the foundation of civil society, mining and agriculture. You don't get buildings, cars, tractors, cell phones, all that stuff without mining. But what is the point of a civil society? Is to support humanity, right? Well, what is the foundation of humanity? It's got to be art. It's just got to be. And so I think mentally, physically, environmentally, art and mining are really difficult to tease apart. They're reliant upon each other. So I was really excited, and I was really disappointed last year when we didn't get to do this art thing in Telluride, and I'm really happy to be here this year. So our next speakers are Michele Mahoney and Matt Hartwell. They are going to be presenting via video. They are both with the EPA. Michele Mahoney is a soil scientist working on contaminated site remediation, specifically guiding projects on soil amendments, remediation and redevelopment and reuse requirements, ecological revitalization, and ecosystem services. Matt Hartwell, Dr. Matt Hartwell, he's an ecologist with the EPA Office of Research and Development, and he specializes in ecosystem assessment, integration and communication of science for decision-making. He helps lead the ORD's national research portfolio on ecosystem services to support community, ecosystem, and contaminated site cleanup decision-making processes. And they are going to speak to us today about ecosystem services, benefits and considerations for the cleanup of contaminated mine sites. And I believe they will show up here on the screen. Oh, all right, video first. Thank you all.
Great. So what we would like to do today is talk with you about benefits and considerations of ecosystem services for cleanups, contaminated cleanups, and particularly mine contexts. All right, so let me start out by saying and introducing some of the concepts of ecosystem services. So here's the classic definition by Gretchen Daly. But what we're really talking about are ways to understand and capture information about the benefits we receive from nature. Since 1997, there's been a big explosion in the scientific literature on ecosystem services, including defining, mapping, counting, valuing, etc. In fact, it was a little free-for-all because without organizing or clearly defining terminology, you could probably connect anything in nature to an ecosystem service if you tried hard enough. That's not quite as helpful as we need for our purposes. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that I mentioned here in 2005 was one of those major milestones in terms of starting to organize how we think about ecosystem services. And I've included it here because this is a good example that's fairly well socialized in the community. There they group services into four main categories with some examples on the right. There were still some issues to work through, particularly in the area of how to value them. And most importantly, particularly for what we're talking about, supporting decisions, how to not double count things. So more organization then is essentially needed. And the EPA has been one of a number of folks that have invested in the development of several classification systems over the years to help with this kind of an effort, including the newest iteration called the Nexus Plus. And while that's a seminar in and all by itself, what I wanted to do was introduce one aspect of EPA's work in ecosystem services that's particularly helpful to think about. And this is the concept of connecting ecosystem services to people. To do that, we ask specific questions about what, about where, about for whom, and for what. And so going with this for whom kind of perspective, this is an approach that we call a beneficiary perspective. And I'll get into that in a little bit. So conceptually what this is a way to connect the what's from the environment to where in the environment, to the people on the ground that receive those benefits. And in the ecology land, we call these final ecosystem services, or those that provide direct benefits to people. So why does this matter? Well, instead of just casually referring to a benefit from nature, simple as water quality, by asking these kinds of questions, the what, the where, the for whom, or for what, we can get a more refined view of ecosystem services that directly inform a decision process. And so here are some examples. Instead of just doing water quality, by asking the what, the where, and the for whom, for what, you can generate these much more complicated, specifically nuanced kinds of descriptors of the benefits that nature provides to people. So here's an example for water salinity, one for water nutrient levels, and one on water turbidity. And they have different locations, and they may actually have different sort of beneficiaries, people that receive those kinds of benefits. By adding this beneficiary perspective, how we think about approaching stakeholder engagement, we can bring in different ways of thinking about how to get people involved. So why might this be helpful in a cleanup context? Stakeholders, when we think about stakeholders, we think about them being engaged in different parts of a cleanup process, or maybe we think about them as having a different range of activities or opportunities as part of steps in that process. By thinking about it from a beneficiary perspective, we're thinking about different perspectives about how we might think about this. And so when we think about beneficiaries, we're thinking more like roles as opposed to individual people. And that gives us a sort of opportunities to enhance the way we think about stakeholder engagement. So why might this be helpful in a cleanup context? Well, here are two examples that I came up with to show you. So first, we know from the social science research that this approach might make for more intuitive entry points into conversations about stakeholder discussions. And so the example here talks about how it might be easier to talk about approaching communications by packaging this discussion in a beneficiary perspective, as opposed to something that's much more technical in nature and not particularly good for the general public. In another example, and I believe this one came out of work out of the Great Lakes cleanups, a beneficiary perspective may afford us the opportunity to talk about the loss of or the gain of a type of benefit of the environment, rather than topics that might actually engender social stigmas. And so that allows us to do things like focus on language that's related to the ultimate goals of what we're trying to do. And so I gave, excuse me, I gave you an example here about, earlier language of like needing to reduce contaminants in a neighborhood might actually bring with it an inherent social stigma associated with it. But with a beneficiary kind of perspective being brought into a conversation space and how you think about communications and engaging stakeholders, it changes the conversation just a little bit. So here's another way of thinking about a beneficiary perspective. So quite often we think about things like the type of cleanup mechanism that's involved, or we think about the types of human health impacts or the types of environmental impacts that we're trying to address by doing those environmental cleanups. From a beneficiary perspective, we can also start to think about it in terms of the benefits that we're going to try to derive from a human health perspective or an environmental perspective. And when you think about it from this kind of perspective, then it's pretty easy to see that there's the ability to talk about this from a larger ecosystem services conversation space. The next piece I'll mention is the 2009 ecological revitalization effort, focusing on turning contaminated properties into community assets. That is, the states that support a functioning and sustainable habitat. While it is case-specific, ecological revitalization is not typically considered an enhancement, so efforts can generally be funded. I've included a few examples here, one on wetlands, one on streams and stream corridors, and one on terrestrial environments. And this work also recognized the importance of long-term stewardship that is necessary to ensure protectiveness of the remedy and the functioning of the associated ecosystems. Okay, so our journey is just about done. So if you would, bear with me for, I think, 2 more slides. In addition to developing these potential activity lists that I just walked you through, we also examined how to approach them using ecosystem services tools to help with those discussions. And so ecosystem services tools is yet another area where we could develop a whole nother seminar around. But I did want to show you some examples tied to each of these 4 steps that I would just walk through. For the identification step, the use of an ecosystem services classification system might be beneficial here. And the value of using a classification system is that it's more systematic in the approach than just simply brainstorming a list. And frankly, hoping that you have enough of the right people at the table, you do that brainstorming, right? What if I have the flu for 2 weeks? And so the inset table here is an example from one classification system that was applied to the lower Darby. For the quantifying step, so this is an area where mapping tools, ecosystem services mapping tools can often be of assistance. And when we think about ecosystem services tools, we quite often think about these sort of geospatial mapping kinds of activities. And for this project, we chose to map a suite of potential ecosystem services. I think there were 7 here, using EPA's Enviro Atlas, which is a web-based mapping tool platform that contains more than 500 data layers. The mapping tool that I'm showing here has had further development since then, but I think you sort of get it. For the effects and impacts step, so this is also an area where geospatial tools can be of assistance. And so in this example, we looked at the INVEST tool to look at the viewscape, so good, not so good viewscapes in and around the Bunker Hill Mine Complex. And so those are the blue dots that are shown on this landscape in Coeur d'Alene, where the visual impacts are displayed by this assorted shading of red sort of being not good and green being much better. Sort of in between. For the last step on how to think about identifying solutions, we did a hypothetical examination of ASTM's BMP table, greener cleanups BMP lists for potential implementation at a cleanup site, and we chose the Bayou Verdine cleanup site in Louisiana. And as a reminder, I mentioned earlier in my talk that there are other sources of BMP information as well. Well, so okay, that's the bulk of your journey with me.
Thanks, Matt, for sharing that information with us. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I'm Michele Mahoney. I'm in EPA's Superfund program. I'm just going to present a little bit of a summary of what ecosystem services are, reiterating some of the things that Matt said, and then I'm going to share with you some examples of Superfund mining sites where we have demonstrated the ecosystem services created as part of the cleanup at those sites. Okay, so as Matt mentioned, he talked about what ecosystem services are. I just wanted to summarize that again and state that they are the life-sustaining products and benefits that people obtain from natural environmental resources and processes. And these are things such as our clean air and water, our timber, pollination of native and agricultural plants. And you find these services in a city or rural area, and these are basically the ecosystems in which humans live to provide goods and services that are familiar to all of us. Ecosystem services are really indispensable to the well-being of all people. Think about the growth of crops for food, our supply of water, regulation of vector-borne diseases and pests and pathogens, and just our overall human health and well-being depends on these services and conditions that we get from the natural environment. And some of the pictures you see on the slides here, the one on the left is some biomass at the Rose Township Superfund site located in Rose Township, Michigan. And then the second two slides are both from Bunker Hill, which we'll talk about a little bit more. So now I'm going to show you some examples of ecosystem services, focusing on sites related to mining cleanup, and also show how the benefits of ecosystem services can be integrated into the cleanup process at any point. But as I mentioned on the previous slide, it's ideal to be as early in the process as possible. This is a picture of a monarch butterfly at the chemical commodities site in Olathe, Kansas. This was a formal recycling site, which is now a community pollinator garden with lots of educational opportunities for the community. So the first mining example that I want to talk about is the California Gulch site. This site is located in Lake County, Colorado. It's an 18 square mile Superfund site, includes the city of Leadville and the surrounding area. Beginning in 1857, prospectors and companies mined the area extensively for heavy metals. And then mining operations left mining byproducts on the site, and these materials contain heavy metals that contaminated the native soils and waterways, such as the Arkansas River. And this site was added onto EPA's national priorities list in 1983. Cleanup at this site, including the city of Leadville, are about 80% complete. EPA took some areas off the MPL, and over the years, EPA has worked with the state, the community, the site's potentially responsible parties to coordinate the continued residential, federal, commercial, and industrial use of the site, as well as redevelopment and ecological revitalization work. So some examples of ecosystem services at the California Gulch site are fishing. Outdoor recreation is a growing sector of the U.S. economy, and recreational fishing is an important part of this sector. At Cal Gulch, the runoff and mining influenced waters once contaminated the waters of the upper Arkansas River. It was so heavily contaminated that part of the waterway did not support fish. But the efforts that have been done to improve the water quality and manage the flow of the water, improve habitat along the Arkansas River has paid off. And in 2014, the Colorado Parks and Wildlife designated a 102-mile stretch of the river, which is downstream of the Leadville site, as a gold medal trout waters, and it's one of the best trout fisheries in the state now. The Colorado Parks and Wildlife calculates that over 100,000 anglers fished these waters between Leadville and Parkdale, Colorado in 2012, contributing to an estimated $7.6 million in total direct economic benefits and $18.2 million in net economic benefits per year. The next mining example I am sharing with you is the Bunker Hill Mining and Meteorological Complex site. So this Superfund site is in Idaho's Silver Valley. It's one of the largest historical mining districts in the world. Mining operations began in this area in 1883 and continue to our present day. Due to these historic mining activities, heavy metals have contaminated the countryside. Local tests found high blood lead levels in area children. So in response, EPA added the 21 square mile area around the old smelter to the MPL in 1983. Cleanup and ecological revitalization around the lead smelter included removal of lead contaminated soil from residential and commercial properties and common use areas such as parks. The lead levels in the children fell dramatically to levels equivalent to national averages by taking those actions. So in addition to these health benefits of the cleanup, revegetation and planting trees has reduced erosion significantly at the site. The erosion control has been very beneficial for the property owners and supports opportunities for placement of infrastructure and reduce risks of damage from erosion. Erosion can be a problem because it fills reservoirs and waterways with sediment, reduces water quality, damages roads and structures. So cleanup and revitalization efforts at this site and many other mining sites include the efforts to reduce erosion. So these hillsides at the Bunker Hill site were once devoid of trees due to the former mineral processing operations. So lots of contamination and erosion on these soils. Cleanup of this site included planting over 2 million trees on 2,290 hillside acres. So now these once degraded hillsides are fully revegetated and healthy, supporting wildlife and pollinator habitat and providing that erosion control. The next site I want to talk about is the Palmerton zinc pile. And this is a site with a lot of pollinator habitats created. This is a former primary zinc smelting operation that resulted in area-wide contamination. It includes the Blue Mountain. There is a large smelting residue pile called a cinder bank, and much of the surrounding valley north of the Blue Mountain was contaminated from this smelting. The former smelting operations released heavy metals into the valley, causing widespread loss of trees across about 4,000 acres of Blue Mountain. Erosion of the contaminated soils in this barren area contaminated surface water in the nearby creeks and the Lehigh River. Heavy metal contaminated dust, soil, shallow groundwater, and surface water. And at this site also, the presence of lead in children's blood samples triggered a public health and environmental investigations, and EPA added this site to the MPL in 1983. So cleanup at this site has included revegetation of Blue Mountain, surface water diversion and treatment, and soil cleanup on private properties. EPA completed the residential property cleanups in 2005. Residential resource island construction and tree planting activities were completed in September of 2013. Monitoring the success of the revegetation and tree planting continues at this site, along with management of invasive species and support of a pollinator habitat. So pollinators make a substantial contribution to the US economy. It's been estimated that native insect pollinators in the United States produce crop benefits worth more than $9 billion, and those are 2009 numbers. Pollinators provide pollination services important for our food production. And pollinators are things such as birds, bees, bats, butterflies, moths, beetles, you know, carrying the pollen from flower to flower and fertilizing the food that we eat. The majority of the world's important food crops, about 35% of our total food production, depends on these pollinators for reproduction. So as part of efforts by EPA and other agencies to respond to recent rapid declines in pollinator species, pollinator habitats are being incorporated as part of ecological revitalization work at, and we're seeing these at several of our mining sites, and I know other types of Superfund sites also. But the Palmerton zinc pile site that we're talking about here supports a 450-acre native prairie, and there was also developed a Lehigh Gap Nature Center, which provides habitat gardens and attracts pollinator species such as hummingbirds, bees, butterflies, and other insects. So the next example is the Black Butte Mine Superfund site, which is near Cottage Grove in Oregon. This was a mercury mining site where mining happened from about the late 1880s to the late 1960s, extracting ore from the mine, crushing it on site, roasting in the kilns to volatilize the mercury, and then bottling and shipping the mercury. There were tailings piles at this site, erosion, you know, contamination of sediment, surface water, groundwater, with mercury and other toxic chemicals, and EPA added this site to the MPL in 2010. So this site has been managed in a number of different operable units. The Black Butte mine area includes the abandoned mine, associated waste from that, and nearby creeks. And EPA has removed more than 1,500 cubic yards of contaminated soil from this former ore processing area, and then also continues to monitor the rest of the mine area just to assess any impacts of the early removal actions that were done at this site, and to identify if there's any ongoing contamination. So one of the important ecosystem services provided at this site is timber production. In a study in 1997, total ecosystem goods and services generated by temperate and boreal forests had an annual global value of $894 billion. And based on this calculation, 520 million acres of these forests in the United States would have an annual value of over $63 billion. In the southeast part of this country, non-timber products produced by forest ecosystems are valued at $300 million per year. There's 9,100 private businesses operating in the forestry and logging sector, employing over 38,000 people. So basically the forest sector generates a lot of money and some jobs. And then, so this site, the Black Butte mine site, was purchased by a timber company in 1990 and is currently being used for timber production, supporting timber harvesting. That's the goal after the cleanup is complete. So in conclusion, I just want to reiterate that ecosystem services generated by cleanup and ecological revitalization of mining sites can create economically important benefits to communities across the country, from marketable materials such as lumber and fish to the less tangible resources such as cultural experiences and educational opportunities. There's interdisciplinary efforts involving ecologists, economists, and others to measure and calculate these economic values of these services. And EPA recognizes the value of ecosystem services and the opportunity for improving ecosystem services during Superfund cleanups. And EPA as a whole is looking forward to quantitatively evaluating ecosystem services during the cleanup process and developing best management practices. And doing this all while, you know, maintaining that our goal is to clean up these sites, you know, to protect human health and the environment. And along the way, these ecosystem services are being created because of what we're doing to take that action. So just trying to communicate that as along part of the process. And these photos you see here are from the Palmerton site that I spoke about, and that's the Lehigh Gap Nature Center that's there. And with that, that's the end of my presentation.
Hi, this is Michelle. I've unmuted. I can't really hear anything at the conference, so I don't know if you can hear me. Yeah, I see talking, but I can't hear you. I apologize. Let's see if I can fix this on my end.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well,
I can hear you now.
Oh, you can hear me now. Okay, so
Yeah.
to summarize the question, we have a question about beavers. Given that beavers used to be prevalent, proliferate all over North America, how does and they're a keystone species, how does their reintroduction and and their value in this framework of ecosystem services work in the eyes of the EPA moving forward?
So we're talking specifically about beavers. Well, that one publication that Matt mentioned in his part of the presentation, the ecological revitalization presentation, talks a lot about different species of, animals, birds, etc., and taking inventory at sites as to what's there and what needs to be protected. So from that perspective, that's how the EPA would look at these types of species that are already present on the site.
Okay, I did paraphrase that question, Michelle. The question asker Rory is putting it into the chat right now. If you wanted to look at it more closely and give a response there, he would greatly appreciate it. I just got one more question to ask. Just give me a second. Have the cultural and traditional values been included in ecosystem services? And specifically, has there been any work with indigenous communities on establishing these ecosystem services?
Yes, that is part of the efforts that EPA is working on, is to be speaking about those types of ecosystem services. Specific interaction with indigenous species, I haven't personally had that with this project, but a lot of that information is available. And so EPA has, reviewed research that's been done with folks who have worked closely with those communities. And we are most certainly including that as part of ecosystem services. That is a very important aspect and something to be measured.
Well, thank you, Michelle. I think we don't have any more time for any other questions, but do look for that one in the chat. And if you could send a response, that would be wonderful. Okay. Again, everyone, let's thank Michelle coming to us remotely, and also Matt. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Okay, thanks for having us.
Next, we have more speakers. You guessed it. So we've got Rob RUNKEL. He's a doctor, Dr. Rob. He's a research hydrologist with the USGS survey, U.S. Geological Survey's Colorado Water Science Center. He works with TANYA PETACH, who unfortunately cannot make it here, but her work was foundational in what Rob is going to talk about. She's a PhD student at CU. So let's please welcome Rob to the stage.
Thanks, Alex. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so the last time I was in this building was a June night in the 1990s. And when I wandered out onto the street about 3 in the morning, leftover salmon, the band was up here still playing and going strong. So anyway, I just wanted to thank the steering committee and the various groups and sponsors for having this in such a incredible building and incredible town. So I've given a number of talks at the San Juan Mining Conference. I think I gave a talk in 2005 and 2006, maybe in Uray. I don't know if it was called the San Juan Mining Conference at the time. I've given talks at the MSI expos and so forth. And I really left Silverton in 2019, 2 years ago, and I told myself I should probably just go to the next meeting and not give a talk and give somebody else the chance to get up here and talk. But it didn't work out that way. TANYA PETACH is a graduate student at the University of Colorado, and she wasn't able to make it today. So you're stuck with me for now. But I promise next year I'll just come and sit in the audience. Anyway, like I said, Tanya is a PhD candidate. She came to me a few years ago and had funding from the National Science Foundation. And that was a really great thing because a lot of students will want to come and work with you, but they don't have any funding. And so my immediate thought was, Tanya, you got to work in Silverton. There's so much data in Silverton. The problem is so complex. It's really perfect for a PhD. And so we started kicking around ideas. And another really incredible thing about Silverton is that there are 4 USGS stream gauges. There's a stream gauge on Mineral Creek. There's one on Cement Creek. There's one on the Animas River above Cement Creek. And then finally, there's one on the downstream end of town that catches everything from those 3 watersheds. So I had done some work previously with a software program called LOADEST. And it's a method where you have observed concentration and flow data. You can multiply the concentration times the flow to get the load, the mass per time. So if you're standing on a bridge, if the load is 5 kilograms per day, if you stood there all day, there'd be 5 kilograms going underneath your feet. So it's a program that helps you take that observed data and develop a regression model. And that regression model can then be used with flow data to predict load. And it had been used a lot in looking at nutrients. For example, in the Gulf of Mexico, there's a big eutrophication problem because there's a lot of nitrate going from the Midwest farms down the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico. And LOADEST gets used to look at trends in nitrate loads going downstream. And you know, with the idea that in the farms they're trying to improve things, and is that really reducing the load going into the Gulf of Mexico? So anyway, we wanted to apply this same thing with metals. And so we did that for the 4 gauges in Silverton. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, I don't think is going to be any big surprise to anyone that's really looked at data from the Silverton area. Katie Walton-Day, for example, has a really great paper on Cement Creek, and she found things that are very similar to what I'm going to talk about as far as how things have changed over time. And I'm just going to talk about the period from roughly 1994 to 2014 before the Gold King. It's a 20-year period. So like I say, it's not going to be a big surprise, but it is you know, the first time there's been a real rigorous statistical approach to all 4 gauges in the Animas area. I just looked at these. Are you still on the first slide, or? Well, anyway, that's fine. You can go ahead. Well, actually go back, sorry. These slides I just saw for the first time this morning. I've been in the field a bunch and haven't really had a good chance to sit down and look at them. So as I baked a Telluride this morning, and I finally got a chance to look, and I would have made a couple changes if I had seen them earlier. Most importantly, I would have put Tanya's name first. This really is her work. She took off with this idea and really made it what it is. The other authors are Rory Cowie, which kind of gives us the locals perspective from Silverton. And then Diane McKnight is a professor at University of Colorado who is Tanya's advisor. And then finally, this talk isn't about art, but Tanya's slides are so much better than mine would have been. It is very artistic. So go ahead. So just a general couple of comments about the whole chemistry part of this talk. Basically, we have these mineralized headwaters with a lot of sulfides. That's where the ores come from. And if you add water and oxygen to these sulfide ores, you basically produce sulfuric acid. That sulfuric acid lowers the pH, and then metals become much more soluble. So we typically have iron and aluminum and cadmium and copper and zinc and in these waters. And what we see is in the headwaters is the iron comes out, and we see the orange precipitates on the stream bed. And then the pH goes up a little bit higher, and we see the white precipitates from aluminum. But then as you get farther downstream, the water actually looks pretty good, but the zinc is still there. And zinc's not a big deal for people. You take a 1 a day and you're good to go. And I was up at the Bagley Tunnel the other day, and somebody's dog was licking up the water like there was no tomorrow. And so it's not a big deal for mammals, but for fish, it's not a good thing. So in this work, we focused on zinc. Next slide. Just a little bit about the geography at all. A lot of you know this already. Let's see if I can.
You want me to point for you?
Well, that's all right. I can point to. I need some exercise. Anyway, this is the Silverton area. At the bottom of the slide is downstream of Silverton going towards Durango. On the left of the slide is Mineral Creek that comes down from Red Mountain Pass. Kind of in the center is the Cement Creek watershed that comes right into town. And then on the right is the Upper Animas. And each of these three have stream gauges, like I mentioned, and each of these three has undergone a lot of remediation over the years. So in the case of Mineral Creek, at the very headwaters, right at the pass there, has been the Kohler Tunnel, and a bulkhead was put in that years ago to seal that off. But there's also been what I'll call surface reclamation in the Mineral Creek watershed. So the Carbon Lakes mining area, for example, there was a lot of work on the tailing piles and revegetation and routing water away from the nasties. And then on Cement Creek, in the headwaters, that's where the Gold King is, that's where the American Tunnel is, the Red and Bonita and the Mogul. There used to be a treatment plant in Gladstone that treated water from the American Tunnel, and it would also occasionally treat water from these other mines. After a while, that treatment plant, the American Tunnel was bulkheaded, and there wasn't a need for that treatment plant, so that treatment plant went away. And then there's also been this kind of surface reclamation in the Cement Creek watershed as well. And then finally, the Upper Animas watershed, Eureka there on the right and stuff. Most of the work has been on the mill sites and mainly surface reclamation. There hasn't been any active treatment there. There hasn't been any bulkheading there. And then on the left here shows the Animas River zinc loading. And this is looking at the gauge at the downstream end of town, A72. And this is from, and I'm not sure where Tanya pulled this data exactly, but it's from around 2011. So if you were to look at this slide from earlier, before the Kohler Tunnel was closed, Mineral Creek would have made a much bigger contribution to the overall zinc load. But when that one was plugged, a lot of the zinc in Mineral Creek was taken care of. We're not sure where it went, but it's not in Mineral Creek. But anyway, a lot of it comes from Cement Creek, those mines I talked about in the headwaters. And then a lot of the zinc also comes from the Upper Animas above Cement Creek. Next slide. So just a little bit about the remediation. I've already kind of touched on this. There's a couple different kinds of remediation that have taken place. For the mine tunnels, there's either been this active treatment like was in Gladstone, where you raise the pH and drop the metals out, or the bulkheads like shown here, where you just plug the tunnel. And then the other type of remediation would be the surface reclamation, where I'm talking about where you get rid of mill tailings and revegetate things, reduce erosion and that type of thing. And these actions are really important for rainfall runoff events or for snowmelt events. On the left there is the hydrograph, and a big part of this work is when you look at these time series, we're computing load, we're multiplying concentration times flow. So if you have a big flow year, you're going to have a big load year, basically. And that plot shows a couple different years, 1999 and 2002, which are incredibly different as far as the volume of water coming down. And then the other thing, just for the prep you for the slides ahead, we're really looking at 3 different time periods. We can kind of break the data up into the base flow period, like now when the flow is really low, there's not much, the monsoons have shut down, snowmelt's not really a factor, and that's the low flow period. Then in the spring, of course, the hydrograph goes up from May 15th to first part of July maybe, and then that eventually goes down. So some of these slides you're going to see we've broken it into base flow period, the rising limb of the hydrograph, and then the falling limb of the hydrograph. That's about it. Thanks. So yeah, the goals of this were to quantify changes in zinc load in the Upper Animas watershed from 1992 to 2014. And this time period was broken into roughly 10-year chunks. So prior to 2003, almost all the major reclamation and remediation activities happened during that period. You had the treatment going on at Gladstone, you had the bulkhead going in at Kohler Tunnel, the bulkheads going in the American tunnel. And a lot of the surface reclamation also happened in the first time period. In the second time period, there was still a lot of work being done. The Kohler got regrouted, et cetera. But just in general, that first time period had a lot more remediation than the second time period. Go ahead. So how's this all work? Like I said, there's 4 USGS gauges. Those gauges report stream flow every 15 minutes. So there's an incredible amount of data there. But you're not going to sample for water quality every 15 minutes. It's just way too expensive and you don't do it. So lots of flow data, but there's also a lot of concentration data. So maybe monthly at all these 4 gauges, especially during certain time periods, there's a lot of data. But the problem is if we want to come up with an average load for the month of January or whatever, we might only have a couple data points and where we have both concentration and flow. So what we do is we use this regression approach where you take your observed data, you calibrate the model, and you come up with this regression model. And then you can plug in those, and we're not going to plug in the 15-minute flow data, but we're going to plug in the daily flow data. And that gives us an estimated load for every single day. And then we can sum those and come up with averages for the year, averages for the month, et cetera. And then the other part of this, and there's a whole journal article on this that has the details, and I'm not going to get into it too much, but to take care of this idea of hydrologic variability, each of the monthly load estimates, for example, is then divided by the monthly flow volume to come up with this flow weighted data. And then that's the results of what you'll see here. And then just to back up, the concentration data, that was a huge effort in itself because we relied on data from EPA, from USGS, from the Animas River Stakeholders Group. And there's a lot of time to compile that data and to QA it as far as like, you know, sometimes the units are reported wrong, for example, and you have to just kind of tease all that stuff out. So that was a big part of what Tanya has done here. Next slide. Oh, crap. Oh my gosh. All right, so here's the observed data and 20 years of data. And I went into it, the different gauges here. So it shows the flow data are the different lines and the points are the concentration data we used, again, for the 4 gauges. Go ahead. So here's what we have. The top one is A68. That's the Animas River above Silverton before Cement Creek comes in. The second one is the Cement Creek monthly load estimates. The third one is Mineral Creek. And the fourth one is A72, which reflects everything from those 3 watersheds. And A68, and actually all of them, you see some of the highest loads in that first time period. And that reflects a lot of this rainfall runoff stuff. And once that surface reclamation was done, you don't see those high loads in the second time period. But you also see, so that's the good news. Things have gotten better for rainfall runoff. The bad news is looking at Cement Creek. Once you've shut down the treatment plant and replace that with bulkheads, you can see the orange area underneath the Cement Creek plot there becomes much greater. So in that base flow period, when flows are low, the concentrations are fairly high, and that's really not good for aquatic life. Mineral Creek shown there, you can see the effect of plugging the Kohler tunnel. The loads have really gone down over time, and it's much better. But the net effect is at A72. Again, you don't see those high spikes early, but the key thing is the trough between each of the peaks. That's that base flow period. And those concentrations and loads have gone up during that period. And that's the most important time for trout. And then finally, I'm getting real close here. So you might have heard me mention model and you might think, well, that's just a bunch of crap. But this plot here is just based on the observed data and comparing the first time period with the second time period. And it's basically consistent with what I've shown. If you just cut to the bottom, A72 there, during the rising limb of the hydrograph, the early period was higher loads than the later period. Same thing for the falling limb of the hydrograph. The early period had higher loads than more modern day. And so it has improved during those rainfall runoff and snowmelt periods. But at base flow, A72 has actually gotten worse over time. You can see the blue bar at the bottom is bigger than the red bar. And that really reflects everything that's gone on in the watershed over these years. Next slide. This is monthly trends. Just real quickly, these are all 4 watersheds. The dots there represent statistical significance. If it's a bigger dot, it's more significant. And everything above that 0 line means things have gotten worse. So Cement Creek at the top, every single month, January through December, is worse over time. A72, kind of the bottom line of it all, is shown there as the blue one, and it's worse over 10 of 12 months if you look at the trends over time. Next slide. So that's the, I think I've hit most of the high points. Things are basically better during spring runoff, but during the base flow period, things aren't as good as they were during that first time period from, say, 1992 to 2003. And I believe that's it, but let's just flick through them here and see what we got. One caveat on this is that some of the bulkheading, it may take years for that to pay off. So, it is possible that things will get better. So that's something to keep in mind. Last slide. Well, one more. Just want to acknowledge NSF provided TANYA's funding. USGS Toxic Substance Hydrology Program supports a lot of my work. I was one of the freaks up in the balcony this morning yelling B during Katie's talk. I'm really into journal articles, and there'll be a paper coming out on this work eventually, actually quite soon. Thanks a lot.
Rob, thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions here in the audience? I had a question for you.
Sure.
You've established that there's the base flow that has a higher concentration. Is there evidence to suggest why exactly? Is there a relationship that you can point your finger at?
Well, the key thing is that those surface reclamation activities don't do you any good this time of year when it's not raining. All those mine dumps and tailings are high and dry right now, so they don't contribute. What is contributing 24/7 is the mine tunnels. And so once you stop treating that water, things are going to get worse.
We've got Rory with a question as well here. We do have a question here in the front. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's the huge question that's really hard to answer. And there's no established way of separating. I mean, man-made from mining, people have proposed different methods. I've proposed a method to do it. But the bottom line, the joke, kind of a joke I like to tell, is that during the 1800s, the USGS was too busy telling people where to mine, and they didn't have time to sample water quality. So we don't know what things were like before the mining.
I think we have one more up top. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it gets a little trickier with the treatment plant at Gladstone. After Gold King, that treatment plant's gone through different phases and operated in different manners. And the data is also a little bit sparser, especially on Mineral Creek in these later years.
Well,
Thanks.
thank you so much, Rob. Thanks for joining us. Let's give him a round of applause. Rob, thank you so much. And thanks to Tanya as well for the research she contributed certainly to this project. Next, we got a lightning round going on where we're going to have 3 short presentations. And we're going to start off with Carl Yost. I'll introduce him in a second, but we're going to have just short Q&A sessions. Really, this is, they're presenting some really cool ideas. Engage with these folks afterwards. So Carl Yost directed environmental construction assets at hundreds of remediation sites in the Midwest, the Pacific Northwest, and across the country over his 40-year career. He's an inventor, he's an innovator, and he's here to share one of his wonderful inventions with us. Please welcome Carl Yost.
Thanks, Alex. And also the steering committee and the planning committee for inviting me and also for setting the theme of this. When Marcy and I first started talking, I don't know where she is out here somewhere, we had an email conversation going. I wanted to know what's the difference between an ingenious application of technology and the creativity behind art. And I haven't been able to answer that until today. On the way down from Duray up to Duray, we met Katie alongside the road, and today you answered part of it. I'm a contractor. I remediation, cleanup, construction, sewer fund work. So I move yellow iron, I treat waste, water work. So I had to do what the A or the B people did. I had to figure out what they wanted. And when we did it, we had to keep the A people happy. So we were in the middle. So it wasn't quite answered, but very close. But after the rest of this, what I've heard today, I'm glad to be towards the end, communication. And so today, this is going to be a little different. I usually do B-type presentations, and all I have to do is hit play, and I'll wait for questions afterwards. I hope you look at 2 things first. There's 2 technologies here. They work. We're willing to go do the work and get paid if we get the results, performance, and if it doesn't, we don't. And then we take these 2 technologies and look at it as a solutions, and I hope you find some threads of interest here. Thanks, Tanya. Any questions?
Yeah, no, go ahead. You
No,
can ask
no,
the
no,
questions
that's
too,
right.
Carl. Yeah, do we have any questions quickly for Carl? And then we're going to jump to the next speaker. Any questions? Yes.
Well, it depends on what's coming out of the mine. Plain and simple, and then the blend between them. And we're looking, we know we can do it with chemistry and how it works electrochemically and mechanical chemistry. There's some other people here that might be able to tell you how to pull the oxides out of the solids better than I could. Yep.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Let's thank Carl again. Thank you so much. We're moving quickly now to Jim Gusick. He's coming to us remotely. So we have a video of Jim. I just wanted to introduce him quickly. Just give me a second. So Jim's presented before. I saw him last year. Always a guy coming up with a new technology. He graduated from the Colorado School of Mines in 1973 with a Bachelor of Science in Mining Engineering. He's here to share another one of his new technologies. So let's welcome Jim Gusick.
Thank you. Can I speak? Hi. Thanks for inviting us to participate. I've been involved in passive treatment design since the late 1980s, and what I'm going to talk about today harkens back to the time when my fellow engineers and scientists were just trying to figure out how Mother Nature works in passively treating mine water. I'm going to turn off my camera so you won't be distracted by my talking head. We've taken over 30 years of experience and passion for understanding how Mother Nature works and condensed it all into a test kit that almost anyone can use to assess whether passive treatment would work at their site. The Proof Passive kit didn't evolve overnight. Due to the pandemic, we found ourselves conducting one-off proof of concept, customized testing for multiple mining clients. Based on that experience, we found some commonality in some of the test units we were using, and so we developed a simple, streamlined approach that could be implemented at much reduced cost and effort. Since the 1980s, nothing much has changed. There are still basically two ways to treat mine water: actively using brute force with chemicals and energy, and passively, which is more holistic and sustainable. Despite 30+ years of engineered development, some consider passive treatment to still be an emerging technology that lacks full regulatory acceptance. To help gain initial acceptance, the Proof Passive kit concept zeroes in on the processes that Mother Nature uses to quickly determine if a particular mine water can be treated passively. For as much progress that we've made in the last 35 years, you'd think we'd have a cookbook by now. Let's say that the effort is complicated due to the many different treatment processes that are available. What we do know is that the geochemistry of mine water will control the cell type, and that the dimensions are mostly controlled by contaminant loading, which is flow times concentration. So if you're not a process engineer and you'd like to see if passive treatment might work at your mine site, what can you do? First, to eliminate a lot of uncertainty, we've come to embrace a standard testing protocol that typically involves laboratory, bench, and pilot scale testing to minimize the risk of failure and to select the appropriate passive process sequence. Most of those tests involve either oxidizing or reducing processes that are found in typical wetland ecosystems. These tests are designed to mimic the larger cells in full-scale passive treatment systems. Now, a lot of consulting companies can help you by conducting these tests at their facilities. Proof passive tests are a way to get your own hands dirty, with proper PPE, of course. So for this talk, I'm going to focus on the basics. Proof of concept tests that can form the solid foundation for a full-scale design, provided that the right set of passive processes are included in the protocol. So what are those processes? This is the passive treatment design engineer's toolbox. We apply biogeochemical principles in actual situations by deploying one or more of these components in series. For convenience, they are shown here divided into components that are biological on the left, and those that are abiotic and rely on limestone dissolution for improving mine water quality on the right. All of these processes would be considered in developing a customized proof passive test kit for a particular site. To help in the sequencing of the process options from the toolbox in the previous slide, I developed this updated version of the passive treatment decision tree about a dozen years ago, and it is a nice guide. The components I find myself using most are highlighted by the dashed line. Biochemical reactors, aerobic wetlands, iron terraces, manganese removal beds. However, when you start to consider how complex mine water can be with multiple contaminants, things can get a little bit messy. That led me to merge the geochemical principles of passive treatment with the periodic table. The red elements are considered passively untreatable and comprise the major constituents of TDS, or total dissolved solids. The green element, calcium, is typically considered a beneficial parameter that adds to hardness. The blue shaded elements are typically handled in reducing geochemical environments like biochemical reactors, BCRs, which is a proof passive test cell type. The orange elements are removed in aerobic or oxidizing conditions, which is another proof passive cell type. Some elements can be managed in either environment. There are also situations where adsorptive processes dominate. In this case, a lot of elements will adsorb the manganese oxide, which is kind of Mother Nature's activated carbon. And this is another proof passive cell type. So getting back to lab proof of concept testing, early in the 1990s and into the new millennium, we were testing everything and anything that might possibly improve passive treatment process kinetics, mostly for anaerobic situations. We learned a lot, but mostly verified that passive treatment processes can work with a variety of materials. Fast forward to today. As I said earlier, about a year ago, in the earlier part of the pandemic, when travel to mine sites was severely restricted, we found ourselves returning to basics and the use of one-off proof of concept testing for our mining clients. The results of one of those on-off projects will be discussed in a minute. And consequently, we developed a proof passive test kit that could be customized for individual mining influence water and shipped to our clients whose staff or maybe even other consultants could use to assess whether one or more passive treatment processes would work at a given mine site in as little as 8 weeks. So let's look at the results of such a study at a tailings storage facility. This one-off project helped to spark the proof passive concept. There were two sources of mining influence water: under drainage from the toe of a tailings storage facility and mining influence water at the end of an open limestone channel about 140 meters downstream. Zinc was the primary contaminant of concern. During a pre-pandemic field visit, it appeared that algae in a downstream pond were participating somehow in zinc removal. More about that in a minute. Our test setup was pretty simple. Aerobic cells were designed to grow algae, and anaerobic biochemical reactors were designed for sulfate reduction and sulfide precipitation. These test units were fabricated at our facilities in Golden, Colorado, and then shipped to the client, where they were assembled offsite in the garage of another consultant/team member. We provided 16 test units, 6 BCRs with 3 recipes of wood chips, straw, biochar, limestone, and a manure inoculant. We varied the amounts of wood chips, straw, and biochar and held limestone and manure amounts constant. We also provided 8 aerobic cells, which were inoculated with gravel and local algae harvested from the site. We also included 2 control buckets. So let's look at some of the data that was collected. pH was monitored every week for 2 months. The source, the control pH, was a bit higher than all the other BCRs, but stayed circumneutral, no surprises. The aerobic cell pHs exhibited a similar trend. BCRs are expected to produce anoxic conditions, and our 3 recipes did so with ORP values around negative 400 millivolts by week 8. The aerobic test cells were expected to exhibit higher ORPs than the BCRs, which they did initially, but then they dipped in weeks 3 and 4. The same happened in the test units that received the channel mining influenced water. The test cells mostly mimicked the control. Aerobic cells were sacrificed after they were sampled for metals and sulfate. So field parameter measurements were not available after week 4 for this set of test units. Zinc removal by the algae and adsorptive processes was evident after 2 weeks, but something happened in week 8, which was in late September 2020 when the days were getting longer. We suspected that the algae died off and released some of the zinc that it had sequestered. Subsequent tests showed that the algae harvested from the site contained up to 2.9% zinc by dry weight. The biochemical reactors did much better. Every test recipe did well, with some zinc removal efficiencies approaching 99%. The BCRs that received the channel mining influence water behaved similarly. The data suggests that biochemical reactors could be an effective zinc removal process. The plant is planning to advance to bench scale testing based on these results. Unlike the aerobic cells, which could release zinc if the algae died off, the BCR process appears to be much more reliable and less influenced by weather. Check out the control, almost 96% removal. It was not sterilized, so natural algae or adsorptive processes are probably responsible for the zinc removal in this situation. So the proof passive test results will be used to design a bench scale test, which will be installed at the site in the next few months, pending budget approval. There are many reasons why an NGO or even a government agency would find the proof passive test kit attractive. For NGOs, having solid technical results to support grant applications would certainly be important. Also, having expert support during testing should ensure that you or your staff collect the data properly. There are other social and practical reasons why a proof passive kit makes sense. Given climate change, the final bullet should resonate with many in the audience. So keeping source materials local can reduce overall project costs. I think these 3 points sum up the primary reasons to consider a proof passive kit as the first design step in your passive treatment project. Thank you for your attention and stay safe.
Thank you, Jim. Are you there live with us? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can, Jim, loud and clear. Do we have any questions here in the audience for Jim?
I'd like to say if Bob Hedden is still out in the audience, you know, this was not targeted towards coal mine drainage. You guys have figured this one out. This is more or less focused on, say, you know, the stuff that's really strange. You know, if you got thallium or you've got mercury or you've got something that's really strange, this is, you know, this would be something to really help you sort out what might or might not work. So I just want to make that disclaimer if Bob is still there.
He's here. He gave a sign of approval. His head's going up and down. His thumbs up all the way. He did hear you.
Yeah, he may even recognize that really funny looking decision tree that came straight out of one of his documents back in the 1990s. So thank you, Bob. Okay.
He appreciates it. How has this proof passive been working so far? Who has jumped on board? Has there been any results?
I've got one other situation. Again, we really started to reintroduce this since the pandemic. I had one other project out in Nevada. It's like a mining company, so I can't tell you who it is. But this one was interesting because it had water coming off of a heap leach pad that was acidic. This is a cyanide heap leach pad, and it was draining into a pond. And the water chemistry in the pond was improving all by itself. It was a volunteer system. We were seeing removal of nitrate. We're seeing removal of some other heavy metals. And we use this to try and figure out what's going on in that pond. And so, you know, it can be used in a variety of different situations. But the answer to the short question, or the question shortly is again, this is, we're still undergoing development. And so, no, the phone is not ringing off the hook. So let me, that answers the question.
Well, thank you, Jim. Thanks for joining us. And everyone, let's give Jim a round of applause for joining us remotely. Thank you so much, Jim.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Last, we got a couple of exciting folks here. They're gonna bring the energy. They told me that. This is our last two speakers. We've got Jeremy and Joe. Jeremy Colliard works for SLR. He is the U.S. Mining and Minerals Business Sector Lead. He's a certified project management professional and a qualified professional in the field of environmental permitting and compliance with over 15 years of experience working in the mining and industrial sectors. Joe Lorino, PhD, MBA, is the founder and president of Periodic Products Incorporated, located in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and the inventor of the company's polymer technology. He currently governs the company's scientific research and technology development. Please, let's give them a warm welcome, Jeremy and Joe.
How's it going, everybody? Last but not least, I guess. Thanks so much for this opportunity to speak and present to you guys and to participate in this conference. This is our second year sponsoring and being here, and we really appreciate spending time with you guys. We could probably just go to the next one. I'll try to go fast for you. You guys probably bumped us last because we're going to take advantage of Carl and Jim, who really gave you the background story of the difficulty of treating mine water, and especially around AMLs, passive and active, and all those fun things. So you guys already know us. So I'm Jeremy. I'm out of Denver. Joe is out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So what, you know, I think a good theme that we keep seeing in this conversation, and just about any conversation in mining, is around water management. It's one of the biggest challenges our clients face, and that includes active mines, operating sites, as well as AMLs. One of my clients often says that he operates a water processing facility that happens to produce copper. And I think that's a pretty true statement. A lot of challenges that we face is around water management. And one of the things that's a real challenge for us with hard rock sites is the complexity of the chemistry of the water that we're dealing with. It's not simply let's manage one or two elements. I have a zinc issue I need to challenge. I have an iron issue. It's usually a complex suite of elements that are a real challenge. And as a result, we have very reliable treatment technologies. HDS is one. It's a great catch-all, whether it be lime or caustic. Adjust pH, settle out solids, and off you go, typically with a polish if you have things like selenium or aluminum issues and that sort of stuff. And then the other one, which I think Jim described really well, is the brute force option, which to me is RO. RO is another great catch-all, but it really is brute force. It doesn't necessarily generate solids, but a lot of brine. And then as we start to deal with higher TDS, becomes a major issue. So one of the things that we hear from our clients, and one of the things for us as scientists that's challenging for us, that we enjoy about those challenges, is trying to find a different technology. And as Jim went through, proof of concept, bench scale pilot out into the field. And so when we talk about AMLs, when we talk about difficult chemistry, we're set with challenges like accessibility and infrastructure. Do we have power? Do we have roadways, access in the winter, that sort of stuff? And then solid waste generation. And so that's where SLR and Joe with Periodic have started working together, is trying to find a solution that could be applied either active or passive, and in this discussion, passively, to address a complex water, typically in an AML fashion. And so it's a remote site and difficult. So what we've gone after is this polymer, which Joe will get into greater detail. I'm not that guy. But as I said, we're looking at both passive and active treatment options. One of our big goals, obviously, is to offset CapEx. A lot of conversations today have been around rare earths, and this technology has a potential there and a demonstrated potential to extract rare earths and other metals to ideally produce a little revenue. We're also looking, as I said, operating and inactive, and we're really focused on not generating solid waste. So again, HDS is fantastic, it can handle really rough water quality, but we do end up with a solid. And then those limited environmental constraints that I had mentioned, lack of infrastructure, lack of access, difficult climates, that sort of stuff. So with that, I'll hand it over to Joe, and Joe will talk a little bit about his technology.
Great, thank you very much. I don't want to go into too much of the chemistry here, but I want to highlight some of the major factors. This is a polymer that is very, very fast, second order kinetics. Thermodynamics favorable, capacity is very high, about 500 times typical ion exchange resins. It doesn't really see group 1 or group 2. So you can use this in areas where you have calcium. So if you have calcium carbonate, if you have phosphogypsum, we did some work with the phosphate industry. This pulls the needles out of, if you will, the haystack, right? So you can pull those metals and the rare earths out of this huge massive waste product. Does not contain nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, reusable. It is going to be insoluble in water. It filters with a regular coffee filter. So it's really easy to actually use. And what we did is we took actually if you will, the sweet spot, we took the capacity and we took the filtration, and the polymer sits there. The next slide, please. This is the polymer. This is the beauty is in the molecule, which I can barely see on this slide. I'm sure you can't, but this is really the art. It took about 20 years to make these, the polymer classes. We can extend the claws, if you will, and we can extend the chains, and we can do a whole bunch of stuff here. So basically, this is the process, whether it's active or, in fact, whether it's passive. You have some acidic material, whether this is what you treat the phosphogypsum or the coal ash, extract the metals. You then can concentrate onto the polymer, and then you can get off in a very, very, very concentrated plug. We're looking at about 3 log concentration. So you can go from ppb to ppm, or you can go for the rare earths to 400 or so ppm, which is what you typically find in these wastes, and you can get it to the 2 to 4%, which is what, for example, the CX columns use when they separate to the 4 nines. So it's really applicable to those kinds of active environments. Again, the effluent's clean. You can recycle the polymer, and this process is closed. This, of course, this of course reduces the OpEx of the whole process. Next slide. All right, so this is a tailing pond, basically a coal mine. There's a culvert between 2 of these ponds. The mining company put our textiles. The polymer is in these white bags here, if you will, and when it sits within the culvert, what happens is these things kind of form a checkerboard pattern. The water then passively flows over it. Next slide. This is going to be really hard to see, but this is really bad water. All right, so a few things I'm going to point out. These are all of the metals. It's not just 1 or 2, it's a whole host of metals. We're looking at sulfate concentrations of 49,500 ppm. You will notice that the influent, the pit water, 13,000 ppm. After we treated it with the polymer, it was 80 ppm, and most of what was left was the calcium and the magnesium. We then took the polymer, treated it with an acidic solution to elute off the metals, and we obtained 13,000 ppm. So we actually recovered all of the metals. And we find that what happens is even with, in fact, the rare earth study that we did, we bind 100% within the accuracy of the instruments, the ICPs. We actually bind the metals, and then we can actually release them, recycle the material. Next slide, please.
Wait, if we can go back real quick. So again, it's the last one of the day, and we give you a very complicated discussion and table. But on the right here are water quality standards. So the pH of this is sub-3. It's essentially a PLS. And this is surface water quality standards for the state of Arizona. And so as you can see, we essentially turned a PLS into a discharge criteria that would allow us to discharge without violating the Clean Water Act. This is part of the process that SLR and Periodic have been working on for a period of time here. We are kicking the tires. We're putting it through the ringer to try to say, all right, well, this is as rough as it's really going to get. I mean, honestly, if we have a chemistry like this, it is a PLS. It's something that's actually quite valuable. So we wouldn't necessarily be treating something like this, but let's really shake it loose and see what we got. All right, so this is a project that we have just wrapped up. This is an AML in the state of Arizona. Arizona Department of Environmental Quality manages it. It is running about 3 to 5 GPM. And so it discharges to an ephemeral wash. So those standards that I just threw up are applicable, and we'll touch on standards in a second. It's isolated. We have no infrastructure. We have no power. We do have roads, but they're pretty rough to get to. And so again, it's a typical AML here. We're trying to find a solution to prevent impacts to surface water that can be successful passively and ideally be left alone for a long period of time. We have a shorter turnaround to come out to site. So our study approach here was we grab some samples, we check out the site, we do a bench scale lab test, and then that's what we'll go to the next slide.
Okay, so the first study was actually a trough study. So we took the bags and we put them into the trough. We did a gallon a minute. The slope was about five or so degrees, and there are 4 passes. So the next slide, here's the table. Now I'll go through this quickly. Here's the native material. We went a single pass is the first time through, and you can see the parentheses are actually percentage bound. You'll also see that we're below the standards for the first pass. We then put the water back through the second pass. So that would be if you had 2 of these in a row, that would be the second pass, the third pass, the fourth pass. Right, so that's through the one set. If you did 4 of these sequentially, the question is what happens with the next fresh gallon? Right, so down here, we took gallon 1, which is the first pass, and then we took gallon 2, which is really the 5th time the polymer seeing the material, and there's really no real difference. So the capacity is there to continue. Right. The next slide is going to be the filter study. We have the polymer laminated between filter media. So these are in various sizes. We have a pump that's pumping in gallon a minute. Dirty water is there, clean water is there. There's a picture of the filter. Again, we did 4 passes. In the next slide, we'll go through the data, and you'll see the same thing here. This is the native water. Here is after each of the passes with the filter, and here are the standards. You can see the filter was much better, but even the, if you will, the textile socks or the tubes were able to treat the water sufficiently.
So the next steps here, we're working with ADEQ. We're looking at a full-scale rollout. You know, there really isn't a point in going forward with a pilot when we're looking at a 3 to 5 GPM flow rate. So we're looking at a full-scale implementation of the, most likely the one-pass filter approach. Although bench scale, we were pumping, we have enough relief here and enough head that we can force the water through our filter, expose it to the polymer, and once it goes through that filter, it's freely discharging and we'll be good to go. That's the engineering side, put simply, because again, this is a relatively low flow. We don't need to do a lot of engineering. We'll continue monitoring for the next year, and then we're evaluating other sites for the state of Arizona right now. We are evaluating some sites with some of our clients on the industry side, private clients as well. And we're looking forward to working with other agencies and working with other clients on this product. You know, the interesting thing that Joe had mentioned is the polymer is going to load up, and then that is the O&M side. So it's going back out to site. It's swapping out these filters. It's swapping out this polymer, bringing it back to a location, hitting it with the acid, getting it back ready. So the next time you're out, you keep that closed circuit going. Next slide. There you go. So we're really excited about this. As I said, it's been a long time. It's been a lot longer time for Joe, but it's been a few years for us at SLR, working with Joe and working on the application of this technology. We've been really patient. As I said, this project for Arizona just finished up a couple months ago, you know, because you don't want to jump the gun and come out here and say, well, we have this great proof of concept. We really wanted to get some application. So we feel a lot of confidence. ADEQ is very happy with our results. And like I said, we're looking to make the next steps. Key things here certainly are that we can actively treat in a similar approach as like an IX column, which is going to be more effective. We can passively deploy this. We're not dependent on bioreactors, which isn't a negative. I'm not saying there's a negative in a bioreactor approach, but we can deal with any sort of a climate. We can sit for a long period. We can deal with variable chemistry. We can deal with variable flow rates. So we're really excited about this. Again, the no solid generation is great. As you can see, we didn't talk a lot about metal recovery for this application because it is an AML. It is really driven to get to us to a discharge criteria rather than that metal recovery, but certainly that is of interest and something that we're chasing down. Yeah, and then as I said, you know, we're really excited to be at this stage, to get this out live next year and get a year or two under our belt and continue to grow with ADEQ, and really hopeful that, you know, through this presentation and hopefully conversations, Joe and I will be around later today and tomorrow. You know, we have some other opportunities to support you guys, whether you be an agency or in the industry with some of your water treatment challenges. And thank you so much. And I'm sorry I ran late. I'll buy you a beer at the thing, but I didn't say that.
Since we are running a little late, if you do have questions, please contact these guys as we take off and go to the transfer warehouse. Sorry, we're just, we need to leave the premises. So again, thank Jeremy.